Angela Carter tightened her grip on Lena's small hand as they approached the crowded boarding gate at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The 7-year-old girl clung to her stuffed bunny, eyes darting around nervously. Airports were always overwhelming for her, but Angela had promised this would be a smooth trip home to New York. "Mommy, are we almost there?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Almost, baby," Angela reassured her, squeezing her hand gently. Angela was exhausted. The trip to Texas had been draining, family obligations, old wounds reopened, and the ever-present exhaustion of being a single mother. But all she cared about was getting Lena home safely. The announcement for boarding echoed through the terminal, and passengers shuffled toward the gate. Angela adjusted the strap of her purse and guided Lena forward. As they reached their row inside the plane, Angela's heart sank. Their assigned seats were next to a man whose expression soured the moment he saw them. Gregory Mathers, middle-aged, impeccably dressed, with sharp features that seemed permanently set in disapproval. He barely glanced at Angela before shifting his eyes to Lena, and then back to the aisle, as if hoping someone would take them away. Angela hesitated, then offered a polite smile. "Excuse me, we have the window and middle seats." Greg let out a sigh so loud it might as well have been an announcement to the entire cabin. He moved his legs slightly to let them pass but made no effort to actually make space. Angela maneuvered around him, helping Lena into her seat before sitting down herself. Greg exhaled sharply and muttered, "Fantastic." Angela pretended not to hear. She was used to this, too used to it. But Lena, innocent as she was, picked up on the tension. She pressed closer to her mother, gripping her bunny tighter. As the last passengers boarded, the flight attendants began the final checks. Just as Angela settled in, she noticed Lena shifting uncomfortably. "Mommy," Lena whispered, "I need to go potty." Angela sighed. "Okay, baby, let's." She turned to Greg. "Excuse me, sir, would you mind letting us out for a moment?" Greg barely moved. Instead, he turned his head slowly, eyes cold and assessing. "Seriously," he muttered. "Didn't think ahead, huh?" Angela's jaw clenched. She could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on them, waiting to see how she'd respond. But she wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of an argument. "It'll just take a moment," she said, keeping her voice steady. With exaggerated annoyance, Greg unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, stepping into the aisle with an air of utter inconvenience. As Angela led Lena past him, he muttered under his breath, "Figures." Angela stiffened. She heard it, and she knew exactly what he meant. Lena did too. "Mommy," she whispered once they were near the lavatory. "That man doesn't like us." Angela knelt down to her daughter's level, brushing a curl away from her forehead. "Some people don't know how to be kind, baby. But that's their problem, not ours." Lena nodded solemnly, though Angela could see the confusion in her eyes. She hated that her daughter had to learn this lesson so young. When they returned to their seats, Greg didn't even bother to hide his irritation. "Well, that took long enough," he muttered as they squeezed past him. Angela forced herself to ignore him, settling Lena back into her seat. But Greg wasn't done. He turned slightly, eyes scanning them with open disdain. "You know, I just don't understand why some people can't control themselves in public spaces," he said casually, loud enough for the passengers around them to hear. Angela's hands tightened into fists. She wanted to ignore him, but Lena was watching. And so were others. "I beg your pardon?" Angela asked, her voice low. Greg smirked, as if pleased he had baited her. "I'm just saying, it's about common courtesy. Some of us know how to behave in public." Angela's stomach twisted, but she refused to let him see it. "My daughter is 7 years old. If you have a problem with that, maybe you should fly private." A few passengers nearby shifted in their seats, some glancing at Greg uncomfortably. But no one said anything. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, believe me, lady, if I had known I'd be sitting next to—" He stopped himself, but his sneer finished the sentence. Angela's breath caught. She could feel Lena shrinking beside her, her little hands clenching her bunny. "Mommy." Lena's voice was small. Angela placed a hand on her daughter's knee, steadying herself. "It's okay, baby." Greg scoffed. "Sure. Whatever helps you sleep at night." A tense silence hung in the air. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but the atmosphere in row 17 was thick with unspoken words. As the plane taxied down the runway, Angela kept her eyes straight ahead. She had spent years learning how to swallow her anger, how to protect Lena from ugliness like this. But it never got easier. She could endure humiliation for herself. She had done it before. But when it touched her daughter, when it forced Lena to question her own worth, that was a different kind of pain. The plane lifted off the ground, and Angela exhaled slowly, gripping Lena's hand. It was just a 3-hour flight. She just had to survive 3 hours. She had no idea that before they landed, everything she thought she knew about her daughter's past, and her own, was about to unravel. The plane had been in the air for less than an hour, but to Angela, it already felt like an eternity. She kept her gaze fixed on the seatback in front of her, silently counting down the minutes until they landed in New York. Beside her, Lena leaned against the window, hugging her stuffed bunny tightly. Greg, meanwhile, sat rigidly with his arms crossed, his expression one of smug satisfaction. He hadn't spoken again since takeoff, but Angela could still feel his presence, his disdain, pressing in on her like a weight. And then, just as she was beginning to think he would remain silent for the rest of the flight, he cleared his throat. "You know," he said, tilting his head slightly in Angela's direction, "it's really something, watching how some people raise their kids these days." Angela didn't react. She wouldn't take the bait. Greg continued anyway. No discipline, no manners. Just letting them do whatever they want. Angela clenched her fists. She could feel Lena stiffen beside her. "She's sitting here quietly, not bothering anyone," Angela said, her voice controlled but firm. Greg gave a condescending chuckle. Sure. But that's the thing about kids like her, isn't it? Quiet when they need to be, but trouble when you least expect it." Angela turned to face him then, eyes blazing. "Excuse me?" Greg smirked. "Oh, don't get all worked up. I'm just saying, I've seen it before. I used to run a company, you know. Had plenty of, let's just say, employees with certain backgrounds. Thought they were grateful for the opportunity, but no, always looking for a handout. Always taking more than they deserved." Angela's heart pounded. She could feel the heat rising in her face, the anger bubbling just beneath her skin. "What exactly are you trying to say?" she demanded. Greg sighed, shaking his head like she was the one being unreasonable. "Just an observation. Seems like some people expect the world to make room for them, no matter how inconvenient they are." Angela's hands trembled. She wasn't sure if it was from rage or the sheer effort it took to hold herself together. She felt Lena's small hand on her arm. "Mommy," the little girl whispered, her voice uncertain. Angela swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a breath. She wouldn't let this man rattle her. Not in front of her daughter. But before she could respond, a flight attendant approached. A young woman with blonde hair tied neatly in a bun, her polite smile barely masking the tension she must have sensed in the row. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Angela and Greg. Angela opened her mouth to speak, but Greg got there first. "Everything's fine," he said smoothly. "Just a little discussion. I was trying to have a peaceful flight, but," he gestured vaguely at Angela and Lena, "some people don't seem to understand personal space." The flight attendant hesitated. "Ma'am," she asked, looking at Angela now. Angela knew this game. She had seen it before. Greg was the type of man who knew how to manipulate situations in his favor. How to make himself look like the victim. She could fight back. She could tell the flight attendant exactly what had been happening, call Greg out for his racist, passive-aggressive comments. But then what? Would the flight attendant really take her side? Or would she just see another angry black woman causing trouble? Angela exhaled slowly and forced a tight smile. "We're fine," she said, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. The flight attendant hesitated for another moment before nodding. "All right. Let me know if you need anything." She walked away, but not before shooting a wary glance back at Greg. Greg smirked. "Smart choice," he murmured under his breath. Angela turned away, gripping Lena's hand tightly. She had let it slide. Again. And yet, despite everything, there was something nagging at the back of her mind. Something about the way Greg was looking at Lena, not just with disdain, but with something else. recognition. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Angela couldn't shake the feeling. Greg wasn't just some racist, entitled businessman. His eyes held something deeper. A flicker of something she couldn't quite place whenever he glanced at Lena. Recognition. And the more she thought about it, the more that realization twisted inside her, making her stomach churn. Greg must have felt her staring because, after a moment, he turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with a smirk. "Something on your mind, sweetheart?" Angela's jaw tightened. "Why do you keep looking at my daughter like that?" Greg's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Just a flicker. But it was enough. She knew. He knew Lena. Angela felt her pulse in her ears. "Do you know her?" Greg scoffed. "That's ridiculous." But something in his voice, a sharpness, a crack, told her she had struck a nerve. Angela turned toward Lena, her heart pounding. "Baby, do you recognize this man?" Lena, who had been quiet this whole time, looked up, wide-eyed. She studied Greg's face, then slowly shook her head. "No, Mommy." Greg exhaled, relieved. "See? You're being paranoid." But Angela wasn't convinced. Her mind was racing now, piecing things together. Greg's age, his wealth, his arrogance. His company. A company that, years ago, had been involved in a high-profile scandal. Angela had read about it. A massive case of misconduct involving underpaid workers, women being mistreated, and, worst of all, children trafficked through fraudulent adoption agencies connected to Greg's business empire. A case that had been buried. That never made it to trial because Greg bought his way out of it. Angela's breath caught. Lena had been adopted. Angela had never known much about her birth family. The adoption agency had assured her that everything was legal, that Lena had come from a situation where her biological mother couldn't care for her. Angela had trusted them. But what if? Her stomach twisted. What if Lena had been stolen? Angela's fingers dug into the armrests. She turned to Greg again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You son of a bitch." Greg's smirk was gone now. His expression was hard, calculating. "I don't know what you think you know, but I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove." Angela felt sick. Was this really happening? On this flight? She looked around, trying to ground herself, but everything felt surreal. The hum of the engines, the muffled voices of passengers chatting, the flight attendants moving up and down the aisle, it all felt too normal for the horror unfolding in her mind. Angela turned to Lena, her voice trembling. "Baby, do you remember anything from before I adopted you?" Lena frowned, her small hands gripping her bunny. "No." She hesitated. "Only that sometimes I had to hide a lot. I think I had another mommy once." Angela's heart shattered. Greg leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Listen to me, lady. You don't want to start something you can't finish. Let it go. You have her now. Why dig up the past?" Angela's nails bit into her palm. Let it go. He wanted her to just ignore the possibility that her daughter had been trafficked like some stolen commodity. Angela's entire body trembled with rage. Greg saw it. He knew he had lost control of the situation. And then, suddenly, a voice cut in. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Mathers." Angela turned. A man from the back of the plane had stood up. Tall, muscular, with sharp, calculating eyes. Jack Dawson. Angela hadn't noticed him before. He had been quiet the whole flight. But now, standing in the aisle, his presence was commanding. Greg stiffened. "You stay out of this." Jack didn't move. He just stared Greg down, his expression unreadable. "Funny thing is," Jack said, voice calm but deadly, "I remember you. And I remember that case. The one you paid your way out of." Passengers were starting to listen now. Whispers. Curious glances. Angela felt something shift in the air. Greg knew it too. He was losing control of the narrative. Jack took a step closer. "You really shouldn't have opened your mouth, Mathers." Angela watched as Greg finally looked afraid. And that's when she knew. This was far from over. The tension in the cabin was thick, pressing down on everyone in row 17. Angela's pulse was racing. She could feel the shift, Passengers had noticed the confrontation now, their curious glances turning into open concern. Greg, for the first time since this flight started, looked nervous. Jack Dawson wasn't just some bystander. His presence commanded attention, and Greg knew it. "Sit down," Greg hissed through clenched teeth, his face pale. "You don't know what you're talking about." Jack took another step forward, slow and deliberate. "Oh, I know exactly who you are, Mathers." He glanced at Angela. "And I know exactly what he's capable of." Greg scoffed, but the usual arrogance in his voice had faltered. "This is ridiculous." Angela had had enough. She turned to the nearest flight attendant, a tall man with an earpiece and a professional but uneasy expression. "I need to speak to the pilot," she said firmly. The flight attendant hesitated. "Ma'am, what's happening?" Angela pointed at Greg. "This man is involved in a criminal case regarding child trafficking. I need to report him." "No." Gasps. Passengers turned. Murmurs spread through the cabin. Greg let out a forced, humorless laugh. "Oh, for God's sake, are you really going to believe this nonsense?" Jack didn't look away from him. "I believe it. And trust me, I'm not the only one." Angela watched as the flight attendant's expression shifted. He was listening now. "Hey, I'll have to notify the captain," he said hesitantly before moving toward the cockpit. Greg snapped his head toward Jack. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Jack smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No. I just don't like men like you." Angela felt Lena shift beside her. The little girl had stayed quiet, gripping her stuffed bunny so hard her small fingers were turning white. "Mommy," she whispered. Angela turned to her, instantly softening. "I'm right here, baby." Lena swallowed, eyes darting toward Greg. "Am I in trouble?" Angela's heart broke. She cupped her daughter's face gently. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong." Greg let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head like he was the real victim here. "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He looked around, eyes scanning the passengers, searching for allies. But there were none. People were watching him like he was exactly what he was, a man who had done something terrible and was finally being exposed. Angela could almost hear his thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years escaping consequences, buying his way out, silencing people. But not this time. The flight attendant returned, looking tense. "The captain is contacting authorities. There will be police waiting when we land at JFK." Greg's face drained of color. "This is a mistake." Jack crossed his arms. "No, Mathers. The mistake was thinking you'd get away with it forever." Angela exhaled sharply, gripping Lena's hand. For 7 years, she had loved this child with everything she had. She had raised her, protected her, given her a home. And now, she had to face the terrifying reality that Lena's past was not what she thought it was. That Greg knew something she didn't. And soon, she was going to find out exactly what that was. The cabin remained tense for the rest of the flight. The whispers never stopped, passengers throwing glances toward Greg Mathers, now slumped in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests like a man about to lose everything. Angela held Lena close, pressing a kiss to the top of her daughter's head. The little girl was quiet, exhausted, and confused by everything happening around her. Jack remained standing near the aisle, arms crossed, keeping a watchful eye on Greg. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We will begin our descent into JFK shortly. Authorities have been notified and will be meeting the aircraft upon arrival." Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is unbelievable. I'm being treated like a damn criminal." Jack laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "That's because you are one." Angela couldn't stop staring at Greg. She wanted answers. "You knew Lena," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Tell me how." Greg didn't answer. Angela leaned forward. "Tell me, or I swear to God, I will personally make sure the world knows what you did." For the first time, Greg looked truly cornered. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted to the window, as if searching for an escape. Then, finally, he spoke. "Her mother worked for me," he muttered. Angela's breath caught. Greg exhaled. "A housekeeper." She got pregnant. Told me it was mine. He let out a bitter chuckle. I wasn't about to let some nobody ruin my life. Angela's hands clenched into fists. So what did you do? Jack asked, voice dangerously low. Greg's gaze darkened. I handled it. Paid people to take care of it. I was told the baby was gone. He shook his head. Guess that wasn't true, was it? Angela felt sick. Lena wasn't just some anonymous child from a broken home. She was his daughter. Angela turned to Lena, who was watching the exchange with tired, confused eyes. She had spent her whole life shielding this little girl from cruelty. And now, the man who had tried to erase her from existence was sitting right next to them. Angela's voice shook. You're telling me you tried to get rid of her? Greg didn't answer. Angela wanted to scream. Wanted to slap him. Wanted to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused. But then she looked at Lena. At her daughter. And she knew that Lena didn't need to see her mother lose control. She needed to see her win. Angela took a deep breath, forcing down the rage burning inside her. You might have tried to erase her, she said, voice steady. But she's here. And she's loved. And she will never, ever be yours. Greg didn't respond. There was nothing left for him to say. The plane touched down. As soon as the wheels hit the ground, Angela exhaled, like she had been holding her breath for years. The nightmare was over. Or at least, this part of it. The moment the plane reached the gate, uniformed officers entered the cabin. Passengers watched in silence as Greg Mathers was pulled from his seat, handcuffed, and escorted down the aisle. Angela didn't look away. Not this time. Lena watched too, gripping her stuffed bunny. When Greg disappeared through the aircraft door, Lena whispered, "He's not coming back?" Angela looked down at her daughter. "No, baby. He's never coming back." Lena nodded, as if absorbing those words, then reached for Angela's hand. Angela squeezed it tightly. Jack, still standing nearby, exhaled. "That's one hell of a flight home." Angela let out a soft, exhausted chuckle. "Yeah, it was." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. "Thank you." Jack shrugged, giving a small smile. "Just did what was right." Angela glanced at Lena, then back at him. "Most people wouldn't have." Jack nodded, but didn't argue. The passengers began gathering their things, filing off the plane. Angela stood, adjusting Lena's jacket. "Ready to go home, baby?" Lena smiled, a real smile this time. "Yeah, Mommy." Angela kissed her forehead. "Then let's go." As they stepped off the plane, the weight of everything that had happened still clung to her. But she also knew this. She and Lena had survived. And no one, not Greg, not his money, not his past sins, would ever take that away from them. They were going home.